It's July 31st, and I'm doing a special interview today with independent journalist Vanessa Beeley, who has spent quite some years in Southwest Asia, or the Middle East, as you may call it. There are many breaking developments, including the 2-day conference at the United Nations where LaRouche organization organizers and the Schiller Institute held a rally insisting on the Oasis plan for economic development, a ceasefire, an end to the genocide and starvation. And they've now produced a document about that. We're going to talk about that. I'd like to get the latest on what's happening in Syria. And so I'm very, very happy to be joined again by you, Vanessa. And we might as well pick up where we started on this, the conference that they just held, convened by Saudi Arabia and France. And of course, Macron chickened out and didn't show up, and then said that he would recognize a Palestinian state maybe in September, who knows when. Starmer despicably is saying that he'll recognize Palestine if the Israelis don't change, which I think is completely disgusting. Yeah. However, the document I thought was not as bad as it was portrayed to be. At least they are condemning the mass murder. They don't use the word genocide. They also say that there cannot be the territorial integrity of Gaza and the West Bank has to be observed. You cannot displace Palestinians. They say that there has to be an immediate ceasefire. They want to fund UNRWA, which was the only agency that was doing anything about getting aid in there, etc. And I know that you have a somewhat more pessimistic, maybe realistic view of all of this process. So please go ahead, share your thoughts.
No, I don't think, I never think of myself as pessimistic, but looking at it in the historical context, I don't have any faith in the utterances that come from these states that have effectively ignored the genocide of Palestinians that has been ongoing since 1917 with the Balfour Treaty, and have done nothing to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians for 100 years. And a country like Egypt that could have alleviated the Zionist-enforced famine that is now ravaging the women and children particularly the newborn babies in Gaza, and claiming their lives through absolutely unnecessary starvation and famine. And then, of course, murdering them when they try to go to any of the 4 distribution points that Trump is now suggesting should be run by Israel instead of the US mercenaries under the Gaza so-called humanitarian foundation that we know now is linked to Mossad anyway. It's linked to the Zionist entity. So what Trump is suggesting is to withdraw the Gaza humanitarian foundation mercenaries that have been running it, and have also been filmed firing on the crowds of Palestinians desperately trying to reach the aid distribution points, which, by the way, they can't get to the aid without facial recognition or, all these other methods that they have to go through to identify themselves. It's total sadism what is going on with regards to the people in Gaza. And when you talk about this kind of conference, why now? We're almost 2 years into the intensified genocide that began after October the 7th, right? Suddenly they're going to recognize a Palestinian state which existed anyway. So all of this kind of political posturing for me is just that. It's just a cynical appeasement of populations that are becoming extremely aggravated by their regime's lack of action to actually prevent the genocide. I watched Keir Starmer's stammering his way through the recognition of a Palestinian state, as you said, from the UK, not from within the UN. Based on what? On Israel changing its attitude? Well, it hasn't changed its attitude in 100 years. As I said, this genocide has been ongoing for that length of time. They're not going to change now. And they were effectively a creation of the British anyway. So, of course, Keir Starmer, who's very much under the control of arch enemy of West Asia, Tony Blair, of course he's not going to proactively do anything to prevent what Israel is trying to achieve in the whole region, not only in Palestine. And then if we look at the statements I just want to make this very important point. We look at the headlines today. I mean, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Macron, Trump are all saying, yeah, fine, we'll end the famine which is in force. So therefore it's violation of every single Geneva Convention, rule of war, humanitarian rule of law, right? Because it's an enforced starvation. And they're saying they're going to lift this enforced starvation. So they're not going to put penalties on Israel for actually conducting the enforced starvation, but they will lift it if Hamas surrenders. What is this? This is a green light for Israel to continue the genocide, because Hamas and the resistance are never going to surrender. And the justification that Trump uses is this claim, which was generated by the Zionists, that Hamas is stealing the aid. Well, US aid has just put out a report saying, actually, this isn't true. In all the cases that we considered, none of those cases include Hamas stealing the aid. Actually, the majority of the aid is stolen or kind of prevented entry into Gaza by Israel. So what is this? This is just a complete green light, which makes a nonsense of the entire discussion for me.
Well, I think also equally cynical is this idea of airlifting food. I saw the response from the Doctors Without Borders, who said, all your brilliant airlifts don't even amount to the amount of food in one single truck.
Yeah,
exactly.
One single truck.
So it's just so people can feel better while other people are starving to death.
Yeah,
and
it takes the pressure off. It takes the pressure off.
No, it is monstrously ugly, but I do think this is breaking. Unfortunately, it's not going to be in time for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people now probably who already have perished. But it is my view that unless the so-called West, which are now the global minority, I'm happy to say, not the majority, the global minority, changes its dramatically, I mean, completely dramatically, a non-linear break from this world outlook, then what we can expect will be worse. And it may not be in the region. It may be a nuclear war. It may be, when you have this kind of unbelievable disregard for human life. And this is a case where, unlike in Nazi Germany, where people claimed not to know, although I believe many of them did, at least in Germany, but it's plausible that people in Kansas were not aware of what was happening in the concentration camps. This genocide has been in front of everyone's eyes. And I do think that the Palestinian people, frankly, have done an unbelievable job in getting the truth out, despite everything, despite the journalists being killed and so on. And you see it bit by bit. I mean, I will tell you, we were out on the corner of 42nd and 2nd, which is across the street from the Israeli consulate, with signs saying, ceasefire, build the Oasis plan. We've been often in New York City with various things that we've gotten out, had to move a number of times because people who turn out later to be with the IDF threaten to beat us up or turn over our tables or things like that. This time, there were very few people. There were some, but I would say it was less than 2% who said things like, oh no, Israel has to do everything that it's doing. Oh, it's justified. One guy said, we need an IDF in the US. And, the
You have
IDF
one.
does, I know, they do train a lot of our police departments. So.
Exactly. That wish has come true.
Yeah, exactly. But others, including, I happened to speak with someone last night who had been really very pro-Zionist, Jewish, affluent New Yorker, who I hadn't spoke with in some time because I just found him so unbearable on this matter. He said, I happened to go by your rally the other day, and I'm really happy for what you're saying. It seems very reasonable. That was surprising to me because it means that even people who have been supportive of Israel's actions up to this time are now, these images of starving children, imagining a mother having to choose. I can't even imagine the anguish that people are suffering. And I think it is having an effect. The question is to direct it to the appropriate action. So
Sorry, you're breaking up a little bit.
Oh, I am sorry.
Yeah.
I wanted to take up something that we only touched on, and it's super controversial, but I do think that it has to be addressed, which is what your thoughts on what actually was behind the so-called October 7th attacks, if you want to say anything about it from where you are, because it's completely impossible at the very minimal that Israel was not aware of it. I am much more suspicious, given Netanyahu's funding and support of Hamas for some time, that there's more to it than that. The timing struck me as absolutely perfect, both for Bibi Netanyahu personally, who was perhaps headed for jail, and what had happened in August of 2007 was the meeting of the BRICS in South Africa. And if you look at which were the new BRICS nations coming in, they're all surrounding that region. Egypt, Saudi Arabia never quite leapt over the threshold to join, Iran, Ethiopia. I could imagine the colonial players, particularly the British and their financial interests, really wanting to throw a monkey wrench into this whole process. Plus, Ukraine was losing the war. It just seemed all too perfectly timed. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to push back slightly on, because this is a very popular conspiracy theory among, let's say, the alt-left, that Hamas was created by Israel to effectively freeze out the PFLP and the genuine resistance factions within Palestine. Now, where I would, let's say, argue with this, and Hamas did play a role in the destabilization of Syria under the old leadership, which was effectively Khalid Mashal, who did pivot the Palestinian resistance from the resistance axis of Iran and the entire resistance region towards funding from Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And to a large degree, Israel was enabling that funding to come into Hamas. From around 2017 onwards, Hezbollah were in discussions with Hamas, and you started to see a change in the leadership. And in 2021, Hamas leaders came to Damascus to meet with President Assad, which was an indication of a change in, as I said, the Hamas leadership. And then, of course, that led to at least one operation against Israel, which, of course, led to Israeli disproportionate aggression in return. And then moving forward, I kind of also...
Wait, can you say when was that first one that you brought up?
So 2021, I think it was 2023.
Okay.
My head is a bit hazy today on that, but I think it's 2023. 2021, from memory, was the Great March of Return, which was the largely peaceful protests in Gaza against the Zionist siege and imprisonment. And of course, what happened? The Zionists fired into the crowds and murdered many with sniper fire and so on. So, people who claim that Palestinians should protest peacefully, well, that's what happens when they protest peacefully. And so for me, I do actually believe that Israel was caught off guard, because I think, and there's a number of people, again, Alistair Crook, who I follow his regular interviews on the subject, and he knows Israel very well. I think they were caught off guard because, to a degree, they've become very arrogant. They believe in their own hubris. They believed that they had all of the Gaza population nailed down. They knew exactly what they were doing and when, and everything was surveilled. And of course it is, to a large degree, just as it is in Hebron, for example, which is effectively a genocidal smart city under the control of the Zionists, where every move by the Palestinian inhabitants is surveilled and tracked, often leading, of course, in their summary execution on the streets of Hebron. But I think what did happen, they were caught by surprise. Mm-hmm. I think then the opportunity was seized, and that's why we saw the Hannibal Doctrine being conducted by the IOF and the massacre of their own people. Right. Those people are not going to be burned alive as they were with machine guns and the rudimentary weapons that the Palestinian resistance had. That's not going to happen. That came from...
Just for our listeners who may not know what the Hannibal Doctrine is, would you just say what that is so that people are clear?
Yeah, basically that it's better to kill your own people than allow them to be taken hostage, because of course there is value in the hostages for the resistance, and also from a perspective of, if military are taken prisoner, they may well have information that they would give to the resistance. So it's better to kill your own people than allow them to be taken captive by the resistance. That's basically the bottom line. And that is exactly what we've seen. And there's multiple documentation of this and evidence of this. And I believe even there have been admissions from within the IDF as to this actually happening. But as I said, that I think very early on we saw the drone footage of all of the cars that were completely burnt out.
Right.
This can't happen with a handful of resistance fighters. It's impossible. And then you have all the testimonies of people that were taking shelter in their homes who were being fired on by the Israeli tanks, right? And who were actually killed by the Israeli tank fire. And all of the stories of, I don't know, the babies in ovens and the rape and so on, they have been multiple times discredited. And if you look at the organization that was collating that evidence, Zaka, the head of that organization has been accused and prosecuted for pedophilia. So, who exactly, and by the way, the Israeli ambassador has just been withdrawn from the UAE for indecent behavior in a bar in the UAE. Wow. This isn't a one-off right. aspect of Israeli society. It's well known to be a haven for pedophiles in the US that want to escape prosecution, either convert to Judaism, and then of course they're given a green light and a green card immediately to enter Israel, where they're not prosecuted, but they continue to live without prosecution. And there are multiple reports, even in Israeli media. I mean, there was a recent one in Israel Hayom where they're talking about ritual child abuse by the ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in Israel itself. It's an endemic problem in Israel, and particularly within the Israeli military. And that has been reported even by...
Right. Yeah. Surprising given the mass rape in the prisons and the fact that you had Israeli soldiers storming a prison to rape people when some people tried to stop it, which also brings to mind, I just have to bring in the British. I don't know if you've seen the book by Princess Diana's brother about the abuse of children in the boys' boarding schools in the UK. Which is extremely prevalent, and they think that you do it because you and I'm not going to go through the lurid details that he describes, including what was done to him in these schools, but it's done to, it is what Theodor Adorno said, if you know that name. He was one of the people with the Congress for Cultural Freedom in Hollywood, and he said that the ultimate aim of so-called modern music, popular music, is necrophilia, but a certain pleasure of death, or an erotic pleasure of seeing people suffer and be killed. This is deliberately cultivated. So I mean, it's not, I mean, what kind of, and I have to say my own hypothesis is that part of the reason why the Congress has been so silent is what are the issues that some of our congressmen may have. Why don't you see a child as a human being? Why are you not moved by this? But go ahead.
Well, yeah, and of course the covering up of the entire Epstein case is a strong indicator of the fact that Congress has an awful lot of things that it wants to cover up. And the same goes for British Parliament. I mean, Sonia Poulton, a brilliant investigative journalist, made a documentary, I think it was quite a few years ago now, maybe 10 years, The Paedophiles in Parliament. Jackie Devoy, another very good independent British journalist, has written, I think quite recently, about the cases of paedophilia in British Parliament. So this is something, as I said, which is endemic among the powerful. And what I find quite interesting is, prior to the fall of the Roman Empire, what did we see? We saw depravity on levels that we had never seen before. And that, in my view, is exactly what we're seeing now in the supremacist hegemonic bloc, which, of course, at the moment, in my opinion, also is led by the Zionist movement. That, of course, is what we're seeing. I mean, when we see a stream of images coming out of Gaza of Israeli soldiers putting on women's clothing and hanging up, like literally hanging a child's toy by the neck, and then filming themselves in front of it, or making fun of each other, and it's sick. It's a sickness beyond comprehension for most of us, thank God.
Right.
But
right. Well,
what it is for me is an indicator of where we're headed if we don't stop this.
Exactly. And I do think that we have today this emergence of a completely new paradigm among the BRICS nations. I want to get back to what's happening in Syria, but I don't know if you saw the interview that President Lula of Brazil did with the New York Times, which he did because here he is, the president of Brazil, a large nation, just, to our south. But he can't get anyone in Washington to meet with him or talk to him. It reminds me of the Russian ambassador, Kislyak, saying, no one will talk to me, or the one, Antonov, I think, who was the last ambassador. He's the loneliest man in town. Here's the president of Brazil. You have Donald Trump running around trumpeting all of his tariffs and bragging about his meetings and how the world leaders are rushing to kiss his ass. And I mean, just foolishness. but no one will talk to the president of Brazil. Instead, we're putting sanctions on Supreme Court judges there because they won't relent on the Bolsonaro case. And Lula was quite defiant. He just said, look, I'm not interested in taking sides in a trade war between China and the US. We're going to sell to whoever is interested in buying. The Supreme Court and our judges is a matter of our sovereignty. So you have absolutely no jurisdiction over that. You're not going to say it. Don't say I don't know how to negotiate. He was, as you probably know, a labor union. He's known for there's absolutely no reason to not talk to us, but we have other options. I am not relinquishing the sovereignty of my nation. I'm not going to grovel. And I think this is indicative. Sadly, the Europeans, and I'm not sure how that relationship works, to tell you the truth, if which way the dictatorship goes between Europe and the United States. Actually, it's a kind of peculiarly corrupt, stinky operation. But there is, look, if you have China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, and now Iran and Ethiopia, you have all of these nations obviously don't agree with each other. Many of them are sort of trying to straddle a fence or whatever, but it's a completely different. The United States does not have the power to wage the kind of economic warfare that we thought that we did. And to your point about the Israelis being caught off guard, I think there's a real blindness coming from in the so-called leadership of the United States, that we have all this power that we actually don't have anymore, because people have other options. If I had a choice between having an alliance with someone who was going to build ports and roads and modern infrastructure, or a partnership with someone who was going to put sanctions on me, starve my people, and overthrow my government, I don't think it would be that hard of a choice.
Yes, I agree with you. And I was heartened to see that the Iranian foreign minister has laid the conditions down for any negotiations. One, demanding reparations from the US for the damage to the Fordo nuclear plant, and the red line being that Iran has the right to enrich uranium for civilian use. And it's kind of nice to see that finally Iran is putting its foot down and is no longer playing nice with the United States. It'll be kind of interesting to see how the Trump administration responds to that. And, China, really, the whole tariff war there was that was just kind of ridiculous. It backlashed so hard on Trump, and it kind of disappeared off into the ether at the end of the day. I think, however, what we are seeing, and I'm only just starting to sort of dig into this, is this whole corridor war, which is now happening. So we're moving, in a sense, beyond normal conflict, normal aggression, which for the US is a state of being, to be at conflict with one or another country for the majority of its existence. But I think now, for example, if we look at Azerbaijan, we're seeing the US basically talking about, through its corporations, running the Zangezur corridor, which runs through Azerbaijan and Armenia, and actually, of course, touches on the northwest border with Iran, so is clearly a threat to Iran, which is why it is proposing the Aras corridor, which will circumnavigate both Azerbaijan and Armenia and drop down into Iranian territory. But I think right now you have Russia trying to protect its South Caucasus from the threat of this corridor, and Israel and the US having control of it. I think Turkey is also racing to maintain its middle corridor, which depends very much on Baku and Azerbaijan to operate successfully. I think India, to some degree, in its alliance with Israel and the US and the Gulf Arab states, with the India Middle East corridor, is also trying to get in on the picture. Ooh, my electricity has just completely gone off, which is very unusual. Never mind. I'll have to stay in the dark for a minute.
Well, keep speaking. We can hear you just fine, so go ahead.
That's very odd. Doesn't normally happen. And so therefore, I think, what we're seeing now, and what we are going to see, is many, even of these BRICS countries, starting to try to come to agreements, potentially with the US. I'm seeing now, for example, Putin and Netanyahu had a phone call the other day. Almost immediately, the so-called Al-Qaeda president of Syria is invited to Baku, to Azerbaijan, for a security meeting with Israel. And of course, that follows on from the security meeting at the beginning of July in Baku, which led to the conflict in the south of Syria. We can come on to that. And suddenly, so after this phone call, we see he's a co-founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria, but he's now the foreign minister of the Al-Qaeda government in Syria. Asad al-Shabani is now being invited to Moscow, along with the so-called defense minister, who was also a former terrorist committing atrocities against the Syrian people. So for me, I think I totally agree with you. The US is not in a position to bully its way through its trade and economic policy. But I think we are going to see shifting alliances that perhaps are rather unexpected in the short term and midterm. That's how I read what's going on now, because we are definitely seeing a flourishing alliance now between Russia and Israel, particularly, of course, as we've talked about before, in Syria, with Russia depending on Israel to lobby Trump to keep the Russian base on the eastern coastal region of Syria, to prevent Erdogan's neo-Ottoman expansionism into Syria. Right. So I think with the fall of Syria, what we've actually seen unleashed is a race for domination of resources in West Asia. And those resources don't only include hydrocarbons, oil, they include, most importantly, rare earth minerals and water. And those two commodities are going to be the new oil, in a sense, because if America wants to release itself from the economic grip of China through the rare earth mineral trade, then it's going to have to seize territory where it can mine rare earth minerals, right? And of course, that was part of the deal in Ukraine.
Right.
That was the attraction of the Ukraine deal for Trump.
Yes, although my understanding is that the vast majority of these things are in the parts that are now part of Russia, although I guess they have plenty otherwise. Maybe that's the lesson. Well, why don't you say something about southern Syria and what has been happening there? I mean, your overview, I think, is very clear and makes sense.
Well, I think, basically what we've been seeing is a lot of maneuvering by the United States through Tom Barrack, who I call Trump's economic hitman, who's been made a relatively inexperienced Middle East envoy to Syria and Lebanon. And just as we talked about really calling for Hamas to surrender so the famine will end, Tom Barrack putting pressure on the Lebanese government for Hezbollah to disarm is the same thing. But effectively, it's a green light either for civil war within Lebanon itself or for an invasion from Israel and from Jolani's Takfiri forces, particularly the foreign mercenaries, which make up about 30 to 40% of his militia. And why we know this is because Tom Barrack basically issued a threat to Lebanon that, look, if you don't toe the line, there's potential that Jolani will annex northern Lebanon as part of Greater Syria. So Barrack has been very clear, actually, that unless Hezbollah disarm, and unless the government does as it's told, they're not going to. Lebanon isn't going to receive funding for reconstruction after Israel destroyed the south. It's not going to basically receive other benefits from the United States either. And effectively, Lebanon will be plunged into war, which I think personally is the most likely scenario right now. We've already had attacks on the northern border from Jolani's Takfiri elements yesterday, and the Lebanese forces, the army, the actual official army, had to go and intervene and send reinforcements. They were fired on. And the Takfiri elements are gathered on the eastern border in Lebanon and have carried out incursions into Lebanese territory. So here we know that something is about to kick off, because America is putting more and more pressure on the government to do something that they know is impossible, because they know that actually, even though Hezbollah is not perhaps popular with some factions in Lebanon, it has the majority popularity. And in a scenario where Takfiri elements are going to invade Lebanon, everyone will support Hezbollah to protect their communities, right? So I just wanted to explain that in the context of what's happening in Syria, because everything's connected at the moment. So as I mentioned, sorry, did you want to?
No, go ahead. I'm just trying to put all this together.
Yeah, it'll make more sense when I explain more what happened in Syria. Because, of course, after I think we talked about this, basically after the ceasefire with Iran, which was entirely of benefit to Israel and prevented the possible annihilation of Israel's military capability, to be honest, listening to reports that have come out since the ceasefire, we knew this meant a pivot towards the weakening and the destruction of the resistance in Lebanon, the complete partitioning of Syria, and the weakening of the resistance in Iraq in case of a later escalation against Iran in the long war against Iran. And actually, that's just one thing I wanted to mention, because you mentioned about Netanyahu's precarious position in power. Yet, what I find very interesting is if people look at the Brookings Institution Which Path to Persia report, which was written in 2009, and it's a number of chapters basically going into detail on the strategy of how to bring down Iran, how to regime change from within and from outside. And basically, one chapter is called Leave It to Bibi. So this was back in 2009, and the war happened in 2025. So this is the degree to which the US perceives Netanyahu's stability and power as very important to their strategy in the region. In my opinion, that's how I read it, because I found this extraordinary that in 2009, they didn't say, leave it to Israel, in the knowledge that perhaps this war would happen in 5 years, 10 years, or whatever. Right. But it was called Leave It to Bibi, right? And remember that it was Netanyahu that commissioned the Clean Break Doctrine in 96, 97, written by the CIA, which was a strategy paper that is now coming to fruition with the partitioning of the Middle East and so on. So I just wanted to put that in there, because I think while, yes, of course, Netanyahu is a corrupt creature, he's a horrible creature, but he's the US's creature, you know, and I think his position is pretty much assured while he's acting in the role that the US wants him to. And I think that's kind of important for people to get a grasp of. Right. And then, so if we come back to Syria, what happened was Jolani had already had a security meeting with Israel, I think back in April. in the Gulf countries, in the Gulf. Then in July, there was a meeting in Baku in Azerbaijan, and there were very early claims that he had met with an envoy of Netanyahu. They were denied, but then they were admitted by a press release from the government of Azerbaijan itself, Ilham Aliyev, the president. And so at that point, it became clear that while perhaps full normalization with Israel was a way off, what they had agreed on was a security pact, a security agreement. And what did that agreement entail? That Jolani and his Takfiri militia would effectively become an enforcer for Zionist expansionism in the region. In other words, they would protect Israeli interests by attacking Lebanon, the resistance in Lebanon, and destabilizing Lebanon and Iraq. And they would be allowed to take over territory, which would give them a corridor from Iraq to Lebanon, which would, one, prevent the resistance in Iraq coming to the help of the resistance in Lebanon and vice versa, but also enable Jolani to channel ISIS elements from the northeast and from the east and the desert into Lebanon to carry out suicide bombings and other such isolated attacks to destabilize communities here in Lebanon. And we've already seen arrests of these terrorist cells inside Lebanon by the security forces. So it's happening. And right. Then the second thing that happened as a result of this meeting was this weaponization of the tribal factions inside Syria, who were incited by Jolani's media and Telegram channels to turn on the Druze in the south. And while Jolani was kind of saying, oh, it's nothing to do with me, it's all the tribes and I'm trying to stop them, the reality is exactly as the Zionists did in Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon in 1982, when they opened the doors for the phalangists to go in and massacre the Palestinians, and they stood back and said, it's not ours. Right. It's exactly what Jolani did. So he stirred up the hatred in the tribal factions, and he basically let them go through all the checkpoints. And his own militia, which include ISIS, were fighting alongside the tribal militias and massacring the Druze. I mean, there were some of the worst atrocities that we've seen, and on a par with the coastal massacres, but actually, I think even more intense. The bloodlust has just increased to a level which is demonic, satanic in what they did. And all of this is to enable Israel to go, oh, we'll come in and protect you. We'll provide protection. We'll bomb HTS and we'll bomb the tribal factions, and we're your friends. And we'll bring in the Palestinian Druze to settle in this area. And, we'll provide you with weapons, and we're the good guys. Right.
Very duplicitous. Now, you had written this paper that we discussed before about the role of the British, Tony Blair. I think Jonathan Powell is coming more to the fore. And I am going to push back on the American question, because I think our nation was not founded to behave this way. And John Quincy Adams, in his July 4th, 1821 address, when he was Secretary of State before he was president, was very clear. He said, we haven't invaded anyone for 45 years. So we got a little bit of a start there. And that if we do this, he said that if we get involved in any other country's wars, we will no longer be the ruler of our own spirit. He was very clear. And of course, later he came back into the Congress to win the famous Amistad case against slavery. And I think that really was the intent of the founders of the Republic, but we've never been able, they say, to form a more perfect union, I think because they were very well aware of the shortcomings of the time, and that the fight internally here has been between these factions that strongly believed in the equality of every human being and inalienable rights coming from that, versus this financier. I mean, we had it in Boston, we had it in New York, we had Andrew Jackson, we had some of the most horrific traders who had this oligarchical outlook. And I do have to admit that you could say perhaps since the death of FDR, Truman's decision to drop the nuclear bomb, there's been very few voices of what I consider the actual Republican with a small r tradition in our nation. It's been a total war. We've seen presidents assassinated and leaders like Martin Luther King. The British actually had a hand in this. I think their dream is, and you heard it, they want the United States to rejoin the Commonwealth, which I find a completely disgusting, abhorrent idea, because it further hides the point that we are not supposed to be like this. And if that's what you do, it's what you said about empire. Every empire collapses of its own weight, because if you're going to enact this kind of aggression and looting and sickness against other human beings, then you've destroyed any purpose of existence. The human race actually cannot survive that way. And we saw it with Rome. I keep thinking of various things from the Peloponnesian Wars books, particularly when the plague swept through. If you remember, everyone panicked and said, well, let me just be as degenerate as I possibly can, because I'm not going to live that long anyway. So I think because it's the 250th year of our Declaration of Independence, that a possible chamber of resonance with Americans to get them to revolt against these horrible empire-like policies is to remind people that the point, if you look at everything in the Declaration of Independence of why we left the British, our country is now doing all of those things. Occupying other people with standing armies, unwarranted search and seizure, total lack of justice, no freedom of speech, no freedom of... We are now doing exactly what we rebelled against. And so part of what I'm trying to do here as an American is to wake people up and say, hey, this is not you. We are not peace through strength. What a despicable, stupid idea. I mean, that is...
Well, because ultimately it's not even peace through strength, it's peace through force. And that's a huge difference, and I think language is very important. I mean, I saw a headline in what was it, the New Lines Institute. Instead of talking about regime change, they're now talking about regime evolution, which sounds lovely. It's just like, but this is what happens. People fall for this kind of packaging of really the absolutely abhorrent tactics to arrive at a control of resources or a country. I mean, Syrians are absolutely irrelevant. Palestinians are irrelevant in the bigger game. And this is
are the
we
European,
have to stop.
The European people and the American people, right? You can, I mean, what is Ursula von der Leyen? Oh, the American LNG is so much less expensive than... I mean, just a bald-faced lie. So, hi, everyone. We're getting ready for war with Russia, and to prepare, you're going to starve and freeze to death in the dark, but don't worry.
Yeah, but, this is my point. I mean, to a degree, I see the war, and we've talked about this before, that the war is without borders now. It doesn't matter if you're American or you're British or you're French or German. It doesn't actually matter. If you're among the irrelevant class, which is, let's face it, the huge majority of us, then you are dispensable to the bigger game in this, right? And that goes for, I'm sorry, but it goes for Russia and it goes for China and it goes for everyone, for the transnational ruling class right now. Because if I look, there's a genocide right now in Palestine. I think it has to be of our lifetime one of the worst long-term atrocities that we've had to sit through for almost 2 years. Right. There isn't a single country within BRICS, apart from Iran, let's say, and of course Yemen, that is not included in any single, big country complex, who have actively, alongside the non-state resistance actors, gone to the aid of Palestine. But other than that, there is not one country that has done anything concrete except condemnation. And condemnation is great for a couple of weeks, but for almost 2 years, where you continue as one of the major trading partners of the country that is committing the genocide. And here I'm talking about India, I'm talking about China, I'm even talking about Russia. Or you're in bed with the collaborators with Israel, which include the UAE and Egypt. Like, at what point do we say enough? At what point do we call upon these governments and these organizations that claim to be non-aligned to actually take concrete steps to stop what is happening? And that could begin with a boycott. It doesn't have to mean conflict. It doesn't have to mean aggression, measures of aggression, right? It can start with boycott. It can say, and people say to me, oh, but China's only supplying, air fryers or something to Israel. But actually, that's not true. They're invested in the settlement programs. They're invested in Haifa port. And they are actively supporting Israel through trade. Their non-conflict drones are being converted by Israel into drones that are carrying out the attacks on the Palestinians. So my point is, I'm not because they're not responsible for what's going on, for sure, because that responsibility lies entirely with, as you said, Britain and the entire Zionist bloc alliance. However, they have the power from an economic perspective and from a political and diplomatic perspective to be able to put a heck of a lot more pressure on than they are doing currently. And stop talking about a two-state solution. Start talking realistically about what should happen with Palestine, that it should be a one-state Palestine where, as before 1917, where Jews and Muslims and Christians and atheists and communists and every single denomination lived peacefully together.
Well,
sorry, I'm a bit sort of wired today. There's so much going on. Fine. It's very difficult
I think the people there will have to decide, but obviously you can't even run around talking about a two-state solution if you don't officially, formally recognize Palestine as existing, which has yet to have been done. Your comments just remind me of what Naledi Pandor, the former foreign minister of South Africa, said to one of the Schiller Institute conferences. And I was sort of actually taken aback by her optimism that the North could weigh in, not realizing all of the things that had been done to boycott the South African apartheid regime by so many people around the world. And the global North actually had very much participated in arms embargo, economic embargo, all kind, refusing to seat the South African delegation at the UN because they were all white. So that is really well taken. And I think that kind of pressure absolutely can and must be brought to bear.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I mean, actually, Russia, the Soviet Union, was actually training the ANC military. So it was actually actively supporting the resistance against the apartheid regime. But when it comes to Israel, no.
Yes. Well, then it's up to us, as Shelley said, we are many, they are few, as you were pointing out. We have to get organized into a better way. Now, I will tell you one thing that I have some hope in, not if it's merely left to what the Trump administration intends to do with it, but we are trying to broaden and deepen this investigation of what happened with Russiagate. I think it's very important. Gabbard, I think partly because of her position in the Trump administration and trying to stay there, is focusing on the attacks on Trump, Hillary Clinton, Obama, etc. But my point, and we'll be actually producing a white paper to get out to all of Washington on this, is what was the purpose of this was the British game, which frankly goes back to 1945, to get the US to have a war with Russia. Winston Churchill was working on this then, Operation Unthinkable. And so what was the point of saying that Russia had meddled in the elections? Was to ensure that normal relations with Russia couldn't happen, and that you would already create the conditions where Trump in his first term was on a war trajectory with Russia. And that's the intent. And if you look at how all of this unfolded, you see Robert Hannigan of GCHQ coming over here and meeting with John Brennan in June of 2016. And the London Guardian actually has these people are so arrogant. They just speak publicly about what they're doing, I guess, because they think no one will be able to do anything about
attention.
Yeah. And they said, well, we were the first to point out, the British intelligence, that the Russians were hacking the DNC servers. We were the first to. So they created this narrative, which was then fed in. I mean, as far as Obama and Tony Blair, I think they're like this. They might even be the same person. I don't know. Maybe they don't appear in the same room together for that reason. But I'm hoping, because the Americans are very weary, there's still enough people alive, although most of, unfortunately, our World War II veterans have now passed away. There are people alive who remember the assassinations of Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Bobby Kennedy. And they've always felt, and including the family members of those people, that we never got the truth on these assassinations, that there's something very, very wrong in the intelligence process and community of the United States, including emphatically, I will say, the news media. I mean, how is it that John Brennan, the head of the CIA torturer in chief, comes over and is a news anchorman at MSNBC? You know, maybe people should think about that. But I want to seize on this. I'm hoping, fighting with that, I think these things can come together, that perhaps we can get a break, that we can break out some of this stuff, that we can purge some of this warmongering, treason, faction out of here. And I'm sure you've seen that there's real ruptures in Trump's own base, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who now is, I guess, the first congressperson who called this genocide, what Israel is committing in Gaza. And she was completely irate and public about it when Trump bombed Iran. And she, you know, I think there are some serious fractures, which with proper leadership, we may, sort of like tuning a laser, you know, if we can get it right, maybe we can, or an opera singer who breaks the glass with the right pitch. If we get it right, maybe we can shatter this control that's been over us for so long.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to be optimistic about that. I think from a perspective in this region, when I'm speaking to people here connected to the resistance, or even not connected to the resistance, even just living here and understanding that the war is not against Hezbollah, it's against Lebanon, and it's against the whole region. To a huge degree, I think now the sentiment is, well, we're on our own. And so therefore, we're just going to have to fight this war alone and you know, do our best to survive and to come through it intact and facing a better future. So I think the two things run in parallel, but I think regionally people have kind of washed their hands of the West because nothing has been done to alleviate their suffering for 100 years. So why on earth would you know, even looking at the ICC or the ICJ or the UN to do something, they don't. Because as much as they will do the theatrics of it all, ultimately they're controlled. by the UK, as you pointed out, the US, and that whole cabal that effectively controls any decisions within the UN with the veto. So people have kind of given up, to be honest, with change coming from the US or the UK or anywhere in the West that is part of the alliance with Israel. They've given up on that. So, right. Which in my opinion is kind of a good thing, because you're not waiting for the big hand to come down and take you out of trouble. You're actually going to deal with it yourself. And I think people in the West also need to understand that when the armed resistance takes prominence, they have the right to do that, right? Because that's also enshrined in international law, that if you're facing occupation or oppression by a hostile force that is intent upon basically ethnically cleansing you from your territory, you have the right to resist. That's one thing. And the other thing is, while I was kind of slightly mocking the Israeli role in southern Syria, of course it is absolutely appalling what they're doing, because now I get a cat. Go down. Because effectively what they're doing is they're orchestrating the massacre of the Druze in order for the Druze, in desperation, to call the Israelis for protection, at which point they annex the Sweda province in the southeast of Syria, which then enables them, of course, to extend the David corridor up the eastern border using the US illegal military base at Al Tanif on the border with Iraq and Jordan to extend upwards into the Kurdish-held territory in the northeast, of course, another partner with CENTCOM and the Pentagon in the northeast of Syria, and to access the water in the Euphrates, right? So it's, while I was kind of trying to make light of it, it has a very serious implication both for the people in Syria, because effectively what this means is the partitioning, the carving up of Syria. And I've just written another long piece, which should be published today or tomorrow, about the regional players, how they're now going to try and carve up Syrian territory. And so, it is appalling what they've done. Literally, if I'm speaking to people in Sweden who are telling me about the atrocities that they face, and while they understand Israel's role, my friend said to me, Vanessa, my family are facing death. What am I supposed to do? But this is orchestrated, Diane.
Right.
When you see your neighbors having their head cut off in the street or being burned alive, or what are you supposed to do? But this is being orchestrated by Israel to achieve what it wants. And even, I'm sorry, just a very chilling comparison with what Trump is doing to the deportees in the United States. If you look at the alligator Alcatraz, as it's been nicknamed, in Florida, right? And there was a testimony from a Venezuelan detainee, and he said, we're literally being forced to accept deportation because the conditions are so awful here that in the end, we're going to voluntarily allow ourselves to be deported. It's the same tactic.
No, that's
it's exactly the same tactic.
Right. Peace through force, what you're saying.
Yeah.
And of course, the idea that that we believe in freedom, well, as soon as you're doing it through force, it is not freedom, it is dictatorship. So, yeah, absolutely. Your last comments, and we have to wrap up, but it does bring me to the Oasis plan, because the question of fresh water is absolutely major in this region, and it is a reason for a lot of the land grabs and strategic is people trying to get control of the water flows. I just did a symposium with a delightful Italian nuclear engineer and materials engineer who had taken the Oasis plan that LaRouche proposed in 1975. And he said, well, as an engineer, let me try and figure out what you need physically to implement it. And he was looking at water consumption per capita, where in Jordan, I think it's 500 cubic meters per person per year, which is very little. I said, what does that compare to the West? And I looked it up. The US is 2,800 cubic meters per person per year. That includes everything, of course, industry, agriculture. France is 3,200 cubic meters per person per year. So he determined that in order to get that amount of fresh water in the whole region, not just Palestine, Israel, but the region, you would need 25 new 1,400 megawatt nuclear power plants, 25 in that region, just doing desalination, and then a whole bunch of the smaller modular plants, which I found fascinating. And he also debunked the whole idea that if you have nuclear power, you're going to build a nuclear bomb. He said, actually, it's very, very hard, especially now the fourth generation plants, you can't even, he said, it doesn't work that way. If you want a nuclear bomb, you're going to build a nuclear bomb. It's actually easier than building a nuclear power plant. This from a nuclear engineer. It was fun. I think we have to think of the future of where mankind has to get to, or we have no guidance point of whether we're moving in the right direction. So we've gone slightly over an hour, and we should probably wrap up. Do you have any final words? I want to thank you very much for joining me again. I know people really appreciate these interviews, and what you give us in terms of a strategic analysis is excellent. So thank you.
Thank you, Diane. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the platform being able to speak openly with people. No, I don't have anything really to add to that. I just think, we have to unite behind the idea of a better world, one that has genuine equality, not a sort of mirage of equality that hides the transnational ruling elite agendas, basically, that have nothing to do with equality. They have to do with resource and power grab and territory grab. That effectively makes the existence of the human beings in those zones of targeting absolutely negligible for them. And I think, we have to, because today it's this region, tomorrow it can be America or any other part of the world. And, we keep sort of reiterating this, but I think it's very important to do that, because we have to, in a way, stop partitioning ourselves into being American or British or whatever. It's a global issue.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And to people watching this, tomorrow, Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, you can go to schillerinstitute.com to get the link for the International Peace Coalition. I would encourage people to do that. And as always, please share, like, subscribe, and donate to the LaRouche organization.